Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's CEU webinar, Safety and SIRS, Reserve to the Rescue. I'm Zoe Prince. I'm the Regional Director here with Alliant Association Management. We're very excited to have everyone join for this really important discussion. As community associations across Florida continue to navigate evolving reserve requirements, structural engineer integrity reserve studies, and long-term capital planning, having the right expertise and guidance has never been more critical. That's why we are so pleased to partner with Reserve Advisors and welcome today's presenter, Matt Kusel. Matt serves as the regional executive director for the Southeast United States at Reserve Advisors and brings more than 25 years of experience in reserve study planning and infrastructure strategy. A licensed professional engineer, reserve specialist, and a certified CEU instructor, Matt has consulted with over 1,500 communities throughout his career. Beyond his impressive technical credentials, Matt is widely recognized throughout the community association industry as a trusted educator, speaker, and advocate. He served on the CAI National Board of Trustees, contributed to Florida legislation discussions surrounding reserve funding and structural integrity requirements, and was appointed to Florida's Structural Integrity Reserve Study Task Force. So what makes Matt especially valuable to our industry is his ability to translate complex engineering and financial concept into practical guidance that boards and managers can confidently implement. As a current condominium board treasurer himself, he understands firsthand the challenges communities face when balancing safety, compliance, and financial responsibility. Today, Matt will help us better understand how reserve studies and SIRS requirements can serve as a powerful tool for protecting our communities, planning for our future, and making really informed decisions. So that being said, please join me in welcoming Matt from Reserve Advisors. The floor is yours, Matt.
Thank you so much, Zoe. That's such a nice introduction and a mouthful. It's been my entire career. Yeah, I've been dedicated towards reserve studies and reserves. I've actually had the unique pleasure of working with reserve advisors for my entire professional career, which is very unique in this industry. And just excited to share with you today some of the information that we've learned along the way through both my role as a board member, but more so in my role as an engineer and working with the state. We're going to talk about just an overview of SIRS. I call them SIRS. They're Structural Integrity Reserve Studies. Some people say SIRS, but I'm in camp SIRS. I think the SIRS is a department store that I don't think is open anymore in most locations. So as SIRS is the way I pronounce it. But we'll talk about the important reporting requirements, disclosures, incorporating SIRS into budgets, waiving partial funding restrictions and options there. Quick overview of different funding strategies, and then what's considered completion of a SIRS. I've also got a little bit of an interactive survey that does not appear to want to work right now. So let me see if I can do a quick technical change here on this. Last time I just had to open it back up on my other screen. Bear with me for one moment.
No problem.
Okay, here we go. Won't think it. See, is it cooperating now? Yes, there it goes. So now I just need to reshare. Sorry for that.
No worries, Matt.
It worked in practice, but here we go. Here we
I
go.
do have a
Yeah,
question that came in
sure.
right now, and I did want to re-bring it up because I think you made note to this in the beginning. We have someone who asked, is this only applying to condos?
Yes. So structural integrity reserve studies do only apply to residential condominiums, three biddable stories or more. So we do have other courses for other types of association, but this one is certainly a focus on condos. think some of the concepts we talk about when you get a funding strategies apply to both, but this will be very heavily focused on condos. So if you're an HOA board member, understand if you want to sign off at this point and catch the next one that might be more pertinent to HOAs. But this is really specific to condominiums, 3 stories and above, and the new laws following the tragedy in Surfside. Um, so hopefully you can see now the QR code on the screen. Oops. Okay. And if you can, take out your phones. I know you probably have them nearby. We always do. Um, let's see. Okay. And use the QR code. You should get something that says like your presentation is ready. And so I just moved it over to the first question, which is really important to me. And it's summertime. You got to think about it. I just got done with a week off myself and got our family out to the beach for some beach and chill time. So I'd love to hear the audience if you want to let me know your favorite summer vacation if you get a chance here. And then maybe it looks like no one's really into the adventure. I usually do an adventure one later in the summer. I get out of the heat and go up north on a camping trip with buddies from long time ago, and my brother that we've been doing for geez 30 years now. Well, there we go. Got a couple
Oh,
campers
that's so fun. I'm going to the Smoky Mountains next week, so I'm pretty excited
Nice,
about this
very
summer
nice,
vacation question.
very nice, very nice. And that might be a little different than an adventure. I don't know. Is it an event? You guys do an adventure in the Smoky Mountains, or do you just kind of chill mountains and chill?
Maybe a day of
There
adventure.
you go. There you go. A lot of staycations too. Well, we live in Florida, so it's hard to complain about that. Okay. Oh, we got Margaritaville in there too. Nice.
Nice.
All right. I'm going to move over to the next question, which is a little more pertinent to today's discussion. For your condos, and I guess if you're a manager, maybe think about your most recent SIRS for a condo. When was it completed? And if it's never done, that's okay. This is totally anonymous. We won't tell anyone that that's the case. But just kind of curious, what the distribution is. The law kind of first went into place in late 2022, but very few firms did any SIRS. I think our first one was like November of 2022. So there wasn't too many that were too much prior to 2023. 2024, December 31st, 2024 was the initial deadline. Then the deadline moved to December 31st of 2025. And it looks like that's when a majority of the folks on the call here had their last one completed, and a couple had it this year. So that's good to know when your most recent one was completed, because that's going to be the one that you're obligated to follow as we talk about. This is a little more open-ended question. What aspects of reserve studies do you think are most confusing or challenging? This one can kind of be open-ended. This helps us as reserve study providers, and hopefully help us today in our discussion here to address some of the confusing aspects of reserve studies. We hear that a lot. There's a lot of information. Again, with the new laws and changes, that things can get confusing. And as a board member, or even a manager, you're not dealing with this every single day and day in and day out like I am. So I always like to kind of poll the audience on what is confusing or challenging with respect to your reserve study, and we can certainly try to address hopefully some of that today as it pertains to SIRS. Um, Money is one of the answers. Of course, that's challenging. Yes, money is challenging. I think one of the things that we understand, and I think a lot of us commiserate with, is never want to tell our neighbors that they have to their monthly fees are going up. It's never a fun discussion to have. But I think as board members, it is so important to be transparent about what the true cost of ownership in the community is. So difficult, challenging. Hopefully, these reserve studies and your reserve providers can help you through some of that. Um, Good. Quite a few other answers here. The cost of two reserves, the SIRS not being pooled. So there's the idea that we need two different reserves now. Um, Totally new to board, trying to understand the ins and outs. We'll get through a lot of those today. Can't go negative in 30 years. How do you plan for cost 25 years from now? Okay, we'll talk a bit about this. Minimum number of units in a 3-story condo. So This is a good question. We'll talk about that later today in the presentation. Understanding what needs to be done in money, the amount, money, pooling. Okay, good. Mix of 2 and 3 story buildings incorporating both reserves. That's going to be a little topic later on too. So thanks for bringing that up. I'll make sure we touch on that. And forecasting replacement costs amid volatile inflation. That's a really the inflation factor is a really big one, and I think one that we have to do our best. None of us have a crystal ball with inflation, so we want to put something in there for inflation. We look at the last 30 years of construction inflation, which is different than CPI. It's different than what cost of goods and food and things are, but we look at those items and use that last 30 years to try to put a placeholder for the next 30 years. But inherently, that's going to be inaccurate, and one of the biggest reasons why updates are needed somewhat frequently. And it's so great to see a lot of you have had a reserve recently, because as you continue to do those, that will be there. We paused our reserves for 2 years. Okay, we can talk about that. Difference in infrastructure. If a year we find ourselves more cash reserves, we claim we are all refunded. Can we claim that we are all refunded and adjust our contribution in the following years? Good questions. Okay, we'll try to get to a lot of these. I may come back to this later in the presentation. And my last question here on the survey is just if there's one thing you wish your reserve study provider offered, I'd love to hear that, and we can hopefully incorporate that in our future iterations. We're always trying to do better at what we do. Reserve advisors have been doing this for 35 years this year, but we constantly are looking for ways to evolve our deliverables and ways to evolve our messaging and offerings, report format, whatever it might be, to make it the most useful for communities there. So follow up with implementation, I think, is one of the things we continue to hear about, and why we offer unlimited support. So I think that's what the reserve study shouldn't be a one and done deal where you do the report and walk away. We want to be there, and you really should have a partner in your reserve provider that can help you with the implementation, ask questions as if you get there. A live what if sandbox tool rather than a static PDF report. Interesting. So we did actually for about 12 years, we had a software that was a cloud-based software that allowed boards to make those types of changes. But we found very, very, very little use of it. So maybe the boards, maybe now things are changing as technology evolves. And that's something we need to maybe reiterate. I know there's some softwares out there that allow that. Right now, what we give is the Excel spreadsheet to allow you to run different scenarios in Excel, but maybe there's another tool that would be needed. Appreciate that. And how to explain the SIRS. And so that one, I just want to remind people, you're not, as a board member, you're not alone in this. Your Alliant will help you with this, but really your reserve study provider should help you be able to explain this to the members. It's not your fault that the laws have changed. It's not your fault that the costs are what they are and that inflation is what it is. And so don't put that all on yourself. You surround yourself with a team of people to do this. We don't get paid very much as board members. We don't get paid at all as board members. And so to take all that responsibility and liability on, yourself is an awful lot. We'd love to help with that if we can. So I'm going to do a quick switch back over to the presentation. Thank you for the surveys and indulging that. Like I said, we'll hopefully come back to that and answer all those questions and things in this presentation. So here we go. And resharing. Now it wants to work in that. Okay. So why do we have SIRS? Obviously, the tragedy in Surfside. We had the lawmakers say we cannot continue to allow associations to waive reserve funding. We cannot allow boards to spend reserve money on aesthetic items and not structural items. So that was important. And we also can't let buildings go forever with never changing ownerships, because in a commercial building, when commercial buildings sell, residential buildings often, you might have an owner sell and you have a home inspection on a single family home. Well, condos don't ever get that because we don't ever have a turnover of the entire association. So buildings that reach 60, 70, 100 years of age may never really get inspected outside of the elevator and fire inspections and things that we have after they're built. So an independent inspection program they felt was needed statewide. There was one, coincidentally, ironically, I guess, in Miami-Dade and Broward County prior to the collapse. So, but that was at 40 years. It's now moved up to 30 years, and so that's for the milestone inspections. The SIRS identifies 8 specific items here that need to be included. So the roof, the structure, the fireproofing, fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical, waterproofing, exterior painting, and windows and exterior doors. Um, all of these items, again, just items that are the association's responsibility. So if the windows and exterior doors are the owner's responsibility, those would not be included in the SIRS. But this is the list of components. The structure, is one that raised a lot of eyebrows initially, and that kind of evolved over time with the iterations of the law. But the structure is not necessarily full replacement of the structure, but it is maybe repairs to structural members. The biggest one we see here is like concrete restoration, or other items that might fall in the structure as far as repairs versus replacement. We hope with proper maintenance, our structures are going to last, more than 25 years of remaining useful life in most cases. There's also a catch-all. So any other items that exceed $25,000, now they're adjusting that annually with inflation. And the failure to maintain or replace such item negatively affects the items listed in the prior slide, as determined by the visual inspection. So this could include things like retaining walls, if they're close to the structure. So if we lose the retaining wall, are we gonna lose the structure? And if so, then that may be considered structural. Swimming pools, if they're in integral with the structure. So sometimes we see a swimming pool above a garage deck or on a plaza, and certainly that's going to be considered part of the structural component. If the swimming pool's on the other side of the golf course and it fails, but it wouldn't have any impact on the structure, that would not be considered a structural reserve component. So a few different kind of some gray areas here. I think that was one of the questions. What's included, what's considered infrastructure or structural versus non. And there's some discretion there. So again, any one of these items I think that I have listed here could be included structural. Another engineer could say, no, that's not structural because it does not have an impact to the other items listed on the prior slide. So that's it. It's again a discussion that you should have, and certainly free to get other opinions on this. Different engineers, like I said, might have different opinions. Even some of the items, here's a list of items that I think are not structural, pretty clearly do not have an impact on the structural components. But I have seen some engineers include some of these things in their SIRS side of the report. And also want to point out that these are very expensive things here. Still, these are very important things. So remember that just because you're a condominium that's 3+ stories and has to do a SIRS, you still are subject to the other original statute, which says we have to reserve for roofing, painting, paving, and anything else over now $25,000. So these items still likely have to be reserved for. They would just not be considered reserve items. And the biggest ones on there, I'm going to call out, elevators and air conditioning equipment. Those are critical to the operation of the association, but not necessarily considered SIRS items. There was the question about what to do if we have a mix of buildings. And this is actually the condo where I live in, and I'm on the board, has some 3-story townhomes and some 2-story townhomes, all connected in the same buildings. And so we kind of looked for clarification from the division on this, and the different attorneys have interpreted this, that generally if the building's less than 3 habitable stories in height, the SIRS requirements are not there. So you can have a roof on the 3-story building that would be considered SIRS, and you can have a roof right next door on the 2-story building that would be considered a non-SIRS item. Both are still required reserves. It just depends which bucket we have. Now we have 2 buckets of reserves. We have SIRS reserves and what I'm calling non-structural general reserves. Some people call it like waivable reserves because it is still waivable to have those other reserve items there. And so that's how we kind of treat those buildings that are less than 3 stories in height. There's also a provision, which I'll get to in a moment, that this does not apply, the SIRS does not apply to single family, 2-family, 3-family, or 4-family dwellings with 3 or fewer habitable stories above ground. So if you have a 3-story building, 3-story townhome, let's say all 3 stories are habitable. If that's a 5-unit building, then that would be SIRS. If that's a 4-unit building, then it would not be SIRS. So I think that was also one of the questions that was confusing or challenging in the early one, is that that's the carve out that the lawmakers make. Um, I don't think they did this on purpose, but they did make it very confusing because they drew the lines in certain areas. Initially, it was all 3-story buildings. So if you had a garage on the first floor and 2 residential above, it was included. In 2025, they came back and said, no, it's just 3 habitable stories. So they wanted that to make 3 stories. Why 3 stories? Why 4-unit buildings are excluded and 5-unit buildings are included? I don't have a good answer. That's the way the lawmakers kind of wrote that and tried to carve it out to make it to balance. And I know this is what they were trying to do, is they're trying to balance being burdensome and um, creating, you know, a difficult situation for some while trying to also balance the safety on other larger buildings. So that's where they drew the line in kind of a gray area in some cases. But I guess we'll continue to try to clarify that. And if you have specific questions about your property, I think again, partner with your reserve provider. And sometimes even we get the attorneys involved to say, okay, well, this, in a mixed use building, for example, it says any portion of the building that's maintained by a party other than the association. Well, if the master association maintains the roof on a high rise because that's the way the developer set it up or the documents read, that may not apply. That particular roof may not be part of it because it's not part of the residential condominium. Moving along here, obviously we must include the items that are listed, the useful life replacement cost. We can exclude items with a long useful life or remaining useful life greater than 25 years. And we can include replacement costs. Your reserve study often will include, this kind of goes back to the structure as I was talking about. The structure may have a repair cost or deferred maintenance expense in lieu of total replacement in the study. So that's kind of clarified in the statutes. SIRS must be completed by either a PE, licensed engineer in Florida, a licensed architect, a reserve specialist, which is a designation from Community Associations Institute, or a professional reserve analyst. And anyone that bids on your structural integrity reserve study now must also disclose their intent to bid on any related services. So when the new law came up, there were certain firms that got into the industry that maybe they were in the construction industry or coating industry or even, engineering services, started to provide SIRS, and they do the SIRS and they say, oh, by the way, we can do the work for that SIRS as well. And the lawmakers felt that was a little bit too close for comfort and protect. Looked like it could have been a perception of a conflict of interest. So we just wanted that to be disclosed up front now. Like I said, must be completed for buildings that were existing prior to July 1st, must be completed by December 31st. And every 10 years thereafter, if your building was built existing, and really what that means is the certificate of occupancy or the turnover occurred after July 1st of 2022, then the SIRS would be done at turnover and then every 10 years thereafter. So this is actually something that they ask the developers to do as well on newer buildings as they turn them over now. New buildings get built, they get built and turned over with the structural integrity reserve study as part of the package at turnover. There was one exception to defer to December of this year if the milestone inspection was due essentially this year, because that gave it one extra year to coordinate those two. And now in 2025, they added that you may delay the SIRS for up to 2 consecutive budget years following the milestone inspection. So they kind of wanted to prioritize doing the milestone first. And I think if they had a chance to do it all over again, they would have said given a different deadline for the milestone and the SIRS, but they didn't. They gave initially both the same deadline, but they really wanted to be clear that the milestone should be done first, and then the SIRS can be done after that to allow for the associations that hadn't planned for 40 years and are now hit with major catch up from the milestone work, as well as a need to increase their budgeting for planning. Really important reporting requirements, and so just stop me if you see questions or you want to chime in on any of this. But I'm just going to keep flying through it because we have a lot of material, and I'm sometimes overly long-winded on this stuff. So I'll try to be concise here. But the reporting requirements are extremely important. The state wants to make sure that associations are frankly doing the studies that should be. So, and they want to make sure the memberships are available or get a copy or at least are notified that it's available for inspection. So within 45 days of receiving the SIRS, owners must note that it's available, or the board must tell the owners it's available for inspection. They also must tell the division that they've completed it. There's a new affidavit that an officer or director must sign acknowledging completion of the SIRS, again, all within 45 days of receiving it. And then the division compiles a list and puts that list on their website, and it is an official record. There is a draft rule being drafted right as we speak from the division that has as a part of it a template affidavit. So as soon as that's adopted as official, we'll get that out to everyone. So I'll send it to you, and you can send it to your customers so that they have a list of a copy of the template affidavit if they want to use that from directly from the state. And a reminder, more than most records, the SIRS is going to be held for 15 years from when it's completed, which I guess is I'm not sure why we have that law, but this is an important website, condos.myfloridalicense, that the state created, that has a lot of questions, frequently asked questions, and a lot of information on it. It also has a link to your online account where you submit the SIRS. It looks like this. You have to provide what profession provided the SIRS, what was the name of the professional that provided the SIRS, etc. This is all done on a portal on the division's website. Again, can be accessed at that website, condos.myfloridalicense.com. And that's where you can also find the database. And here's just a screenshot of a few buildings in Naples that have submitted their SIRS. So this is public information now. So anybody, any potential buyer, any insurer, any mortgage bank that's looking to lend into a community can go online and see if the report was done. And they wanted to do that to make sure it's transparent. And the buildings that are required to do this have done it and have submitted it and notified the division and their membership. Also want disclosures at the time of sale or lease. A potential buyer is required to get a copy of the SIRS. And the contract, now the Florida condominium rider on the sales contracts includes disclosures about the SIRS and making it available and making sure that new buyers understand what they're getting into with respect to this information. Moving right along to the budgets. Budgets adopted after December 31st of 2024. So any budgets adopted now, the reserve amounts in the budget must be based on the findings and recommendations of the most recent SIRS. So essentially the budget, which has the inflows to the reserves, has to match what the most recent SIRS has. There was one of the comments, I think, in the confusing section slide was about, well, if we have the balance is enough, can we refund the money to the owners because we have enough in the balance? No, the budget does not reflect balances. The budget reflects what I call inflows, what the division calls inflows to the reserve. Some call it contributions, some call it reserve requirements, whatever you call it. It's the amount that is coming from the monthly assessment and going into the reserve, funding the reserves. And that is the amount that must line up, not the balance or the specific position, but the amount that you're contributing each month or each quarter, depending on the frequency that you collect your assessments. The general non-structural reserves can still be based on board estimates, and that is kind of as it always has been for those reserves. But again, the SIRS reserves have to really align with the most recent report. Pausing, so they did include a few items that for budgets adopted in the next few years, the reserve contributions can be paused or reduced for quote the purposes of funding repairs recommended by the milestone inspection. So again, this was added in 2025 to allow for prioritization of milestone repairs. So there were buildings that were 50 years old and had never reserved. They got their milestone. They had figured out that they failed phase one. They needed major repairs as part of phase two. And in addition to those repairs, now the reserve requirements were kind of added to those. And so the lawmakers wanted to provide some relief to that and point to some relief that they did. And so they added this, that for 2 consecutive years, you can pause reserve funding for the purposes of funding repairs for the milestone inspection. I have seen associations do very small milestone repairs and pause hundreds of thousands of reserve contributions because of the small milestone repairs that they did. And I would just caution against that. Make sure your attorney is aware of that decision, because I think that is something that is absolutely goes against the intent of this law. It is not a means to stop funding, and anything that you pause, anything that you do not fund, is going to have to be made up in future years. So it's really really not what the division, not what the lawmakers wanted us to do. They wanted to allow for a community that had major milestone repairs to pause some of the additional reserve requirements on there. So if they had, you know, $1 million of milestone repairs and needed $100,000 of reserves each year, pause the reserve portion, not the other way around. Um, and then the funding plans now can incorporate regular assessments, which they always do, special assessments, loans, or lines of credit, if approved by the unit owners. And loans of lines of credit must be immediately available for use by the board. So that's interpreted as must also be approved by the bank. So they have to be approved by the membership and the bank prior to using that loan or line of credit in your funding plan. And any pause, like we just talked about, or a variation from the plan is going to trigger the need for an updated structural integrity reserve study report, so that the next time you start funding it, you're funding at the level that's appropriate based on the pausing or the variation that was made, whether it's special assessment or loan or otherwise. A majority vote of the total voting interest of the association is now required to waive or partially fund reserves. This would apply to all condos, not just the 3 stories, not just the SIRS. But for SIRS items, the ability to waive or pause cannot be is no longer available, unless again the situation where we just talked about, where they're pausing it for milestone inspections or alternate funding sources. So generally, and again, those all have to be approved by a majority of the voting interest of the association. It used to be a much lower threshold to do that, but now it's a majority of the voting interests. And the disclosures of waiving, again, they want to make sure that we're being transparent, and any waiving of the reserves is going to result in likely special assessments towards those items. Just at a higher level, I think it's important just to think about, when we have, as boards, and we have expenses that come up, when we have projects that are needed, the roof doesn't care how we pay for it. The roof just starts leaking. It doesn't ask us how much we have in our reserve, or if we have, extra checking, or if we have a line of credit. It just starts leaking, and it's going to require action on the board. Doing nothing is usually the most expensive option. Ignoring that or putting a Band-Aid fix on it is probably the most expensive option. Special assessments, loans, lines of credit are options in some cases, but they are not any less expensive than saving the money up front. In fact, saving the money up front is the least expensive option over time, because you then can earn interest on the money that you're saving, as opposed to paying interest on the money you're borrowing, or in the case of a special assessment, paying the administrative fees, paying for potential collections or delays in the project, because those are difficult to come in, or they're slow coming in on the payments of the special assessments, which can defer the project and again end up costing more. So, we hear sometimes people say, well, we can't afford these reserves. We can't afford to fund our reserves. I just always caution boards to think about your alternatives. And as a fiduciary of the association, the other options are generally more expensive and do not reflect any savings really over the long term. So it's, again, difficult messaging. I know the money is the challenging part, and it's never fun to tell our neighbors this, but I think as board members, we have to think about our fiduciary duty, have to think about what's best for the community in the long run, have to be good stewards of the community, and frankly have a legal obligation to do so as a fiduciary. So I'm not an attorney, or of course, just practical advice, and again, rely on the people around you to help deliver that message, because it's not your fault, again, that the roof started leaking and didn't ask you how much you had in your checking account before it did. Restrictions on reserves, and this has been the law for 40 years now, but the funds and any interest accruing on reserves cannot be used for any other purpose unless approved in advance by a majority vote of the total voting interest of the association. This threshold also went up a few years back, but the reserves are restricted for reserve purposes. And then again, for any budgets adopted now, owners may not vote to use SIRS reserves for any other purposes. So from that, we ended up with the requirement to, if we wanted to pool our reserves, we had to get an owner vote, because that's what it said. Majority of the vote had to use. If I'm going to take my component reserves, which are restricted for different items, and I want to move them into a pooled reserve for a group of assets, I'm potentially changing the use. So I needed an owner vote. Last year, the lawmakers added this statute, 718-112F4, that says essentially that the board can decide which methodology to use without a vote of the members. A vote of the members is not required for the board to change the accounting method to pooled accounting versus or straight line accounting method. There's still some question on what you do with the other reserves that were set aside there. If you're in that situation, that's probably a legal question. You have to make sure that your attorney is okay with you moving those reserves before you did so. I would say most associations that we're working with are now moving to pooled reserves. Pooled reserves were unique, were not used in Florida. We're really not allowed for Florida condominiums until 2002, which was unique in Florida because everywhere else in the U.S. And abroad used pooled reserves for all of history. But the administrative code was such until 2002 that they didn't really allow Florida condos to pool their reserves. They had to have a separate reserve for roofing, painting, paving, etc. But since that 24 years ago now, we've seen a major migration towards using the pooled reserves because it allows the boards more flexibility. You can use the fund for any item in the pool. Still can't use the funds for anything outside of the pool, but you can use the funds for anything in the pool. And it usually results in a lower annual funding requirement because you're able to look at baseline or threshold methodology, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Of course, having more money on hand or collecting more from the owners is sometimes a better position to have. So some people say that's a drawback of pooled reserves, and also some historically the major opposition to pooled reserves as well. The board's going to make the next board is going to make poor decisions, and they're going to have all this flexibility, and they're going to waste our money by spending it on something that's not needed. I think that's been greatly mitigated by the SIRS requirements that says no, boards cannot spend that structural money on anything other than structural components. They can't take the money for the life safety system and put in new pool furniture. It's not allowed by statute. So that concern really seems to have eased, or that legislation has seemed to ease that concern with the majority of our clients. So I'd say probably 90% of the reports we look at, or the communities we work with now, are done on a pooled basis versus component. Quick section on funding strategies. These are the three strategies identified by the Community Associations Institute and the International Reserve Study Standards. Baseline funding essentially says we want to have a reserve that hits zero at some point. It's the most risky reserve plan funding goal, but it also usually results with the lowest funding level, and it aligns with Florida's requirements that now say that reserves, in fact, SIRS says that it must include a baseline schedule. So really just enough to make sure we hit zero at some point, but we don't go below zero. I usually like to encourage a threshold there, and all that is saying instead of hitting zero, let's take it down to a relatively low number above, but somewhere above zero. So that might be 5% funded. It might be 500,000 for a specific community. We never want our reserves drop below 50,000. Pick the number. We can work with you, or your reserve provider can work with you on what the right threshold is for you, but that's kind of the middle funding goal. And then the most conservative, highest funding goal is full funding, which means maintaining 100% of the fully funded balance. And the fully funded balance for an association is the sum of the fully funded balance for every component in your association. The fully funded balance for each component is essentially the amount of reserves you would have if you started reserving from the day that item was put into place in a linear fashion. So quick example for your roof, if it's a $100,000 roof, let's just say 10 years for math purposes. If it's in year 7, your fully funded balance is $70,000 for that roof because you've used up 7/10 of its total life, and its total cost is $100,000. So take that 70,000, you add that to the fully funded balance of every other component there, and you end up with this very large number. And we say, okay, that's the fully funded balance for the association. And then your percent funded is how much you actually have divided by the fully funded balance. And being fully funded is meaning we've got 100% of the fully funded balance on hand. In most cases, I would say that's generally overkill. It's more funding that's needed, and it's certainly more funding than the statute requires. Again, risk level is probably highest with baseline, lowest with full funding, but the cost to fund is highest with full funding. Next three sides are just quick examples of each. This is a community, very small community, that we looked at 30 years. So the blue line, the blue bars on this graph are the expenses. Some years you can see here, I'm going to put my little pointer on here. Some years you can see there's zero expenses in some of these years. Some years you have very large expenses, and they vary. But the inflows, the green bars, are the inflows to the reserve, and those are relatively stable. The balance, in this case, builds up, hovers around 300,000, then comes kind of crashing down. We've got some of these big expenses out in the future years, and the balance in this case hits zero in 2051. So this is baseline funding because we're allowing the balance to hit zero. And in this particular case, it was about $132 a year per owner to fund this small community. Threshold, same assumptions, same expenses, but the balance in this case, we contributed a little bit more. The green bars are slightly higher. You can't quite see how much higher they are, but they're $9 per owner higher. And that resulted in a threshold that this balance now never, once it gets up there, never drops below 100,000. So this board said, we'd like to leave ourselves a little bit of a cushion. Say some of these projects go a little bit over, say inflation comes, maybe we get a tariff, maybe we get a storm, and we want to have a little bit of extra cushion. For $9 a month, it was pretty prudent for this board to say, okay, let's use the threshold funding method. On the other hand, the full funding method, you'll see we introduced this orange line, which is the percent funded. In order to get that up to 100% funded, the contributions had to be much higher, $213, as opposed to 132 for baseline or 141 for threshold. So this was a much bigger contribution level. And again, I think harder to justify these balances that go up to $1 million and beyond when you're never spending more than, say, $300,000 in a given year. We've got a lot more. I went through that very quickly. We've got a lot more information on funding levels and funding strategies out there. And happy to kind of, if people want, they can reach out. I can send them other webinars or classes, articles, information about those funding levels, because it is very important. And I think we've seen a lot of different funding levels in the different reports that are getting done. What's completion of a SIRS? So this is kind of it was an interesting phenomenon that we saw a lot of communities get a SIRS done, get a report done, but the board didn't accept it. And the board said, well, I don't agree with that report. I don't accept it. So we're not distributing it to the owners. And I just have to share, I don't think it works that way. I think once the engineer signs and seals the report, it's complete and it should be shared with the owners. And that's kind of the division has chimed in on that as well. You can certainly get a second opinion. You can do another SIRS. You can have a person, an engineer, review the SIRS that you've had, or a reserve specialist review the SIRS and do updates and do another one. Usually updates are much less expensive than the initial report, but you are obligated to follow the findings of the most recent SIRS. So if the engineer, the second opinion, gives news that maybe is in the opposite direction, you may be at risk there. So you just got to work closely with partners that you trust on these and work with an engineer that makes understanding it and again communicating it to your membership easy to do. Last couple slides here just on updating. The SIRS requirement, as we talked about, is a 10-year interval. So the state law requires SIRS to be done every 10 years. But that's an awful long time between planning. So most national standards and most best practices suggest a 3-year update interval. The 10 years is allowable, but maybe not advisable. That's one way to look at it. There are three triggers currently in the law that would require an update sooner, and we kind of covered these earlier, but just to recap, if an association has paused the reserve contributions for the purposes of funding repairs, the update must be done before they continue the continuation of the reserve contributions. If the SIRS was performed before the association approved the special assessment or secured a line of credit or a loan, then the study must be updated to reflect that new alternate funding method. And then anytime the budget does not align with the most recent SIRS, meaning again, this is the inflows do not align with the most recent SIRS, the SIRS must be updated before adopting any budget. So those are kind of three triggers that if association gets off track, that wouldn't be an update. The good news is, again, that you don't have to start from scratch. There are two levels of updates. One would be an update with a site visit, and one is an update without a site visit. And both are options depending on, generally wouldn't do, most of our industry would not do an update without a site visit if it's been like more than 3 years since the last site visit, but that's an option in the first few years if needed. And again, those updates just help us minimize any surprises, minimize, and overall reduce the cost of ownership by maintaining a proactive plan, maintaining proactive repairs, replacements. It's just going to reduce any emergency repairs and help maximize the useful life of components. For example, sealing the pavement may lead to may extend the life of that, and if we are funding it regularly, we can avoid bigger expenses down the road. So we look at this thing called the total cost of ownership of an asset, and what's the most efficient way to do the repair or replacement when we look at the value or the functional useful life of the component. So with that, I think my slides are complete. Yes, we still have a couple of minutes. Yeah, still a few minutes left for questions. I've been rambling a long time, so I'd love to go back maybe either to the questions we got initially or if there's any new ones that came in. Before I do that, there's a QR code on your screen with feedback. I appreciate any feedback that you have. If you're a licensed community association manager here, I do need your CAM number, and you can enter it using this QR code on the form there so that I can get your credit. Again, board members will look at the registration log from the Zoom, and if you've stayed on now, if you joined us, I guess at 11 o'clock on time, and you've stayed on now, you've met your 50 minutes of requirement. But please stay on and let's cover some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was really great. We do have a few questions. I will read them.
Yeah.
So one of the questions was, oh my goodness, I'm trying to find it. Is there an advantage for a two-story condo building to engage in a SIRS?
No, I can't think of one. I think the traditional, regular reserve study would suffice for them. I think this came up in one of the challenges of SIRS is that we've now got two different buckets of funds. And what that means is inherently we don't get all of the advantages of pooling the reserves by looking for that one low point in the funding plan. So having two different reserves can doesn't always, but oftentimes increases the amount that's required to fund by looking at them as a bifurcated reserve. So if you can keep them all pooled in one as a two-story building, that would be my recommendation. And there's no additional advantage to having that SIRS broken off into two separate buckets.
Awesome, thank you. Another gentleman, what is the milestone inspection referred to?
Okay, so the milestone inspection, and again, we didn't get too much in it. I mentioned it a couple times, but a milestone inspection is another inspection that is required for buildings 3 stories or more, and it's essentially a safety inspection when the building turns 30 years old. This program is administered by your local, what they call authority having jurisdiction, which is your local building department, your city or county's building department. Will send a letter to the community and building and say, okay, you need a milestone inspection. And the milestone inspection involves an inspection by an engineer to identify any significant structural deterioration at that time. And in the phase one is just a visual observation. If there's no significant structural issues at that time, they send a summary report saying you passed phase one, you're good for 10 years. If you don't pass phase one, it goes to phase two, which requires destructive testing, and then like a remediation plan. And again, that authority having jurisdiction, that building department's going to follow through to make sure those are repaired or replaced. So that's kind of the milestone inspection program, which was done in tandem with the SIRS program. And in some cases, buildings that are older buildings were forced to do both. Newer buildings won't have to do that SIRS again, or the milestone again, until they're 30 years old.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
This might be a combo question, but who is responsible for giving prospective buyers the info regarding SIRS, seller or association?
The seller.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now,
Um,
and you might, yeah, how does Alliant handle it? I mean, I'm interested to hear that. I think most of you guys make that available very easy for your site
Correct.
owners to get that. So
That is correct. We make it available for access. So,
yeah, yeah.
um, we have another question. Is you mentioned makeup in future years. If we waived, does this mean we have to make up the 2 years so the SIRS contribution would be higher?
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Basically, you may have the timeline. You may not have to make up those 2 years all in 1 year or all in the next 2 years. So what we look at is, kind of amortizing those. The example that we showed, it was like 25 years before the reserve got to its critical low point. So in that case, you'd have, if that was your expense profile and your cash flow, you'd have essentially 25 years to make up that 2 year shortfall. Now, if that critical year was much sooner, you might only have 1 or 2 years to make up that shortfall there. And you're new and updated, because if you paused or waived, I can't remember if they said they waived or paused, whatever, however they did that, then that's going to trigger the need to do an updated SIRS. So your updated SIRS then is going to reflect the fact that, yeah, the balances are not what they should have been according to the initial SIRS, and so now we're gonna have to make that up somewhere. The money doesn't just appear; it has to be made back. So
Yep.
there's no golden tickets.
Another question is it true that the SIRS and general reserves are able to be maintained in one bank account or not?
So this is a great question, and one that I posed at the Florida Institute of CPAs conference last year. And the general consensus, according to the accountants, is yes, it is able to be maintained in one bank account. But there was, again, an overwhelming consensus that the best practice might be to separate it. And the reason being is the interest. So the interest earned on the reserve has to be with that reserve bucket. So what some associations do is they'll take the interest and they'll just prorate it. Each month when it's earned or at the end of the year, they'll prorate it back. It's okay. 2/3 of it was structural, 1/3 was non-structural. We'll prorate the interest that way. Having two bank accounts makes that a little bit cleaner because you can see exactly how much interest is earned in each bank account. But so best practice, separate, allowable to be combined.
That was a good question. We've had that a few times on our
Yeah,
end as well. So,
yeah.
um, we have, if at year end, we find ourselves with more cash in our reserve accounts than our studies require, can we claim that our reserve accounts are overfunded and can we reduce our contribution in the following year?
Only if your updated structural integrity reserve study would say that's the case.
Perfect.
And remember, it's not the balance that is being looked at, it's the inflows that have to be looked at. So the inflows, if so just to play that out a little bit, if the balance is higher than expected and maybe projects got deferred or project cost less than you thought it was going to, then yes, theoretically it would reduce the reserve contribution. If the balance is higher just because we didn't do the project and now the project is past due and it's going to cost more next year, that's not going to, that may actually increase the reserve requirement that's needed. So I would be, before you do any refunding or any further adjustments, get an updated structural integrity reserve study to tell you what the appropriate level is now based on the snapshot of where you're at now versus where you were whenever you did the last study 2 years ago or whatever it was.
May tie in a little. If your plan shows a value lower than zero in a much later year, can your SIRS use an assessment to make up the deficit?
Um, That's a good question. Maybe we have to clarify a little bit. So the SIRS plan has to stay, it can't go negative in the first 25 years. So anything with a 25-year remaining useful life has to be funded in the SIRS. So if you say much further out year, I guess if it was year 26 or 28, maybe you can, this wouldn't apply. But if the SIRS is 25 years and it's showing a negative balance at some point in that 25-year zone, you could special assess, but the special assessment would have to happen in the current year. You couldn't special assess 10 years from now to cover that up. They want to see stable funding. You can front load it. They allow boards to come up with plans that kind of put additional in the front end, but I usually don't recommend that. I would usually say like the prior question, let's amortize that out over however many years we have left to make up the shortfall and increase slightly each year for over that period of time to make an equitable assessment of that expense, whatever it is. Again, your the reserves that you have is again at maybe a higher level. The reserves that we have are for the wear and tear that's happening every day. So everyone should be paying their fair share for the items that's wearing out every day. Today, as the sun's beating down on your roof, one little small fraction of its useful life is going away. So let's make sure that the people that are living there enjoying that roof today are paying that one small fraction of that today, instead of saying, well, 10 years from now, we're going to special assess that owner down there. That's not what the state wants us to do, and it's just not a best practice.